Imagine this, it's September 7th, 1191, and the sun is beating down on a dusty battlefield in the Holy Land. 12,000 Crusaders exhausted, sunburned, bleeding, barely standing, suddenly turn as one and unleash a counterattack so explosive that it wipes out 30,000 of Saladin's best warriors in just 17 minutes. 17 minutes. That moment shattered the myth of Saladin's invincibility, reshaped the entire future of the Crusades, and showed how discipline, not swords, not lances, not brute strength, became the deadliest weapon of the medieval world. But the real story doesn't begin with that famous cavalry charge. To understand why the impossible happened, we need to rewind the clock 7 days. 7 days of suffering, 7 days of psychological warfare, 7 days of slow, deliberate marching that looked like madness to everyone watching, including many of Richard the Lionheart's own men. So why did Richard wait while his soldiers dropped one by one? How did an army that was nearly falling apart suddenly explode with enough force to crush an enemy double its size? And why did Saladin's battle-hardened veterans, men who'd conquered Jerusalem and smashed Crusader armies before break and run when they held every advantage? The answers start with two commanders who knew each other better than any enemies of their age. Richard the Lionheart wasn't just England's king. He was Europe's ultimate warrior, King of England, Duke of Normandy. Count of Anjou trained in warfare since childhood. Meanwhile, Saladin was already a legend across the Islamic world, the Kurdish sultan who reconquered Jerusalem, who crushed the Crusaders at Hattin, who united Egypt and Syria under one banner, and whose reputation for honor and skill made even his enemies respect him. Neither man underestimated the other. They'd studied each other's tactics. Interrogated captives analyzed past battles like chess masters reviewing old games. When Richard captured Acre after a brutal 2-year siege, he faced a pivotal decision: march straight for Jerusalem or secure the coastline first. He chose the coast, marching south along the Mediterranean toward Jaffa with his fleet supplying him from offshore. A smart conservative move, or so it seemed. But Saladin had predicted exactly that choice. The 80-mile stretch from Acre to Jaffa ran alongside rolling hills to the east and the sea to the west, a narrow corridor perfect for ambush. With almost no room for Crusader cavalry to maneuver, it was a textbook killing ground. And Saladin filled those hills with 30,000 troops, Mamluk heavy cavalry, Turkish horse archers, Bedouin light riders, Kurdish infantry, an army optimized for mobility speed and relentless harassment. Richard marched into that gauntlet anyway. But he didn't march blindly. At the center of his 12,000-man force were 2,000 knights, fortress-like warriors in 40 pounds of armor with kite shields chainmail, 12-foot lances and broadswords. The Templars held the rear, the Hospitallers held the front. 10,000 infantry, half spearmen, half crossbowmen, formed a living shield around the knights, and Richard drilled them relentlessly into a moving iron box. Shields locked spears angled outward, crossbowmen protected in the middle. It was a formation built for patience, not speed, and patience was Richard's real strategy. When the march began on September 3rd, Saladin unleashed exactly what everyone expected: horse archers sweeping and loosing arrows from composite bows at incredible speed, then disappearing before the Crusaders could retaliate. Arrows fell constantly, not in massive volleys, but in an endless, maddening drizzle meant to break nerves, drain water supplies, and push hot, tired men into reckless charges. But Richard's one rule was absolute: nobody charges without the signal of 3 long trumpet blasts. Anyone who broke formation would be executed. For 7 days, the Crusaders held that discipline. The heat climbed past to 115 degrees. Armor roasted them alive. Horses collapsed. Water ran dangerously low. Arrows slammed into shields nonstop. And every day, Saladin tightened the pressure. By day 3, more than 400,000 arrows had rained down on Richard's army. By day 4, the heat was killing almost as many men as the enemy. By day 5, the attacks escalated into coordinated assaults. The Templars guarding the rear were forced to ride backward in their saddles, holding their shields toward the attackers while their horses were led forward by squires. It was humiliating but brilliant. It kept them alive without breaking formation. Saladin's drums thundered constantly, psychological warfare at its peak. Dust clouds choked the Crusaders. The sound of hooves and war cries never stopped. And every instinct of the knights' men trained to attack, not endure, was screaming at them to charge. But Richard refused. That is what drove Saladin mad. The Sultan expected impatience to break the Crusaders just like at Hattin. Instead, they became more focused, more dangerous, coiling tighter with every mile. And Richard deliberately slowed the pace 10 miles per day, then 8, then 6, almost daring Saladin to throw everything he had at the column. Day 7 pushed everyone past their limits. The Hospitallers at the front had absorbed the worst attacks. Their horses were dying. Their shields looked like porcupines from the arrows stuck in them. Their patience cracked. Their Grand Master, Garnier de Nablus, looked around at his bleeding men and snapped. "I can bear this no longer," he reportedly shouted. What happened next triggered the most devastating counterattack of the Crusades. The Hospitallers charged without orders. Richard had a split second to choose call them back and watch them die alone, or commit his entire army. He chose instantly. 3 trumpet blasts pierced the air, the signal every Crusader had been praying to hear for 7 agonizing days. 2,000 knights spurred forward at once, and the world changed. The moment Richard's trumpet sounded, the battlefield transformed from a slow, grinding war of attrition into a thunderstorm of steel and hooves. 2,000 knights, Hospitallers on the right, Templars on the left, and Richard himself, leading the center, accelerated from a disciplined trot into a full, unstoppable charge. Even after 7 days of torment, their formation didn't dissolve into chaos. If anything, those days of pressure had forged them into something even more dangerous, a weapon wound tight with rage and discipline. Finally unleashed, the thunder of hooves rolled across the plains like an approaching earthquake. Saladin's troops, horse archers who'd spent a week comfortably harassing the Crusaders from a distance, suddenly realized their one advantage, mobility, was gone. The Crusader cavalry wasn't chasing shadows anymore. It was coming straight for them, and it wasn't slowing down. Impact is where physics meets fear. A warhorse at full gallop weighs over 1,000 pounds. Add a 90-kilogram knight in armor and gear, plus a 12-foot lance lowered like a battering ram, and you're looking at the medieval equivalent of a speeding vehicle slamming into lightly armored riders. The first line of Saladin's right wing didn't just break, they imploded. Lances shattered on contact. Horses screamed. Men were thrown through the air. And once the lances splintered, the real killing began. Knights drew swords, axes, and maces, turning the charge into a rolling wave of destruction. Their trained destriers kicked bit and trampled as the knights cut down anyone in reach. What made this charge different from previous Crusader assaults was discipline. Most medieval cavalry charges dissolved into chaos the instant contact was made. But Richard's wedges held their shape. That meant momentum didn't scatter, it kept rolling. The Hospitallers drove straight into Tasi al-Din's veteran cavalry. These were Saladin's elite, battle-hardened warriors who had fought for years across the Holy Land. But nothing in their experience prepared them for the fury of men who'd been forced to endure 7 days of humiliation, heat, and pain. The Hospitallers didn't just attack, they exploded. Garnier de Nablus, the man who triggered the entire counterattack, was at the front of the wedge, smashing through armor and bone with raw fury. Chroniclers claimed he cut down multiple emirs personally. Fear spreads fast on a battlefield, especially when the unexpected happens. Saladin's troops had seen Crusader charges before, short, impetuous bursts, easy to evade. But this was a disciplined wall of iron that kept pushing forward, punching deeper and deeper into their formation. Panic rippled outward. The first few ranks of horsemen fell. The next few ranks turned to flee. The ones behind them saw the flight and bolted too. In seconds, the right wing began to collapse. Meanwhile, Richard and the central wedge crashed directly into the heart of Saladin's Mamluk elite. These were some of the most skilled heavy cavalry in the medieval world, trained from childhood, mounted on fresh horses, armed with curved sabers and deadly composite bows. But even they couldn't withstand knights who'd been holding back every ounce of their fury for a week. Eyewitnesses said Richard fought like a man possessed, striking down enemy commanders with terrifying precision. His household knights surrounded him in an iron fist, carving a path straight through the center of Saladin's line. Muslim chroniclers compared the Crusaders to mountains of iron rolling down upon us, a poetic way of saying they were unstoppable. Then came the real turning point. The Templars on the left flank saw the enemy line buckling and adjusted their angle. Instead of driving straight forward, they swung inward, smashing into the exposed flank of Tasi al-Din's collapsing wing. The effect was catastrophic. Imagine being trapped between 2 charging wedges, one fueled by fury, the other by icy discipline. Hundreds died in moments. By now, the Muslim line wasn't just dented, it was disintegrating. What was supposed to be a killing ground for the Crusaders had become a death trap for Saladin's own men. For the first time in years, the Sultan's forces were not the predators, but the prey. Saladin watched helplessly as thousands of his best troops were cut down. His personal guard closed around him as the battle dissolved into chaos. He tried to rally the reserves, but by then fear had spread faster than orders. Units that had never broken before began to waver. Then they turned. Then they ran. Panic is contagious. Once the elite fled, the rest followed. Richard saw the opportunity and led a third charge directly towards Saladin's position. This wasn't about ransom or capturing high-value prisoners. This was extermination. The Muslim reserve didn't wait for impact. They broke before Richard's wedge even reached them. Saladin's banner fell, not captured, but abandoned. His bodyguards had to drag him from the field to keep him from being overrun. In less than 20 minutes, the entire battle had flipped from a slow grind to a total rout. Now came the pursuit. Normally, medieval battles ended once the enemy turned and fled. But this time, the Crusaders weren't satisfied with victory. They wanted vengeance. For miles, they chased down riders, cutting down stragglers, smashing pockets of resistance. The slaughter only slowed because the war horses, pushed to their limits, finally began to tire. When Richard finally sounded the recall trumpet, the field behind him was carpeted with bodies. 7,000 dead in just 17 minutes of actual close combat. For comparison, the Battle of Hastings, one of the most famous clashes in medieval history, produced about the same number of casualties over the course of an entire day. At Arsuf, the Crusaders did it in a fraction of the time. But here's where Richard's genius really shows. His knights begged him to continue the pursuit to chase Saladin all the way to Jerusalem and finish the war right there. And honestly, they might have done it. Saladin's army was shattered, demoralized, fleeing in chaos. But Richard said no, absolutely not, because he knew something everyone else didn't. His army was exhausted, his horses were spent, his men were dehydrated, wounded, overheated. If he pushed them into another fight, they could walk straight into an ambush or collapse from exhaustion. Victory makes armies reckless. Discipline keeps them alive. So Richard did the unthinkable. He stopped the pursuit, regrouped, his forces tended to the wounded, and reformed his lines. Then, as calmly as if nothing happened, he continued marching toward Arsuf exactly as planned. That decision preserved the Crusader army, and it changed everything that followed. Within days, news of the defeat spread across the region. The aura of Saladin's invincibility, carefully constructed since Hattin was shattered. Cities that once resisted now opened negotiations. Garrisons that would have fought to the last man suddenly reconsidered their odds. Jaffa, which Saladin considered strategically essential, surrendered without a fight. Ascalon began sending envoys. The entire balance of power in the Holy Land shifted in a single afternoon. But the real impact of Arsuf went far beyond that battlefield. The aftermath of Arsuf didn't just rewrite the course of the Third Crusade, it rewired medieval military thinking for centuries. Commanders across Europe had always believed heavy cavalry was powerful, but unreliable. Knights were brave, sure, but also impulsive. They charged too early, got baited into traps, lost formation, and often turned victories into disasters. But what Richard pulled off at Arsuf proved something game-changing. Heavy cavalry wasn't just a blunt force weapon. Under the right commander, with iron discipline, perfect timing, and coordinated infantry support, knights became the most devastating shock weapon on Earth. And every ruler in Europe took notice. Richard didn't win because he had more men. He didn't win because he had better train, or better horses, or better armor. He won because he weaponized patience. He turned endurance into strategy. He allowed his army to suffer intentionally so the enemy would commit everything, overextend, and walk right into the killing zone. That lesson echoed far beyond the deserts of the Levant. You can see versions of Richard's strategy at Waterloo, where Wellington absorbed punishment to lure Napoleon into deadly mistakes. You see it at Cannae, in Hannibal's deliberate retreat to encircle the Romans. You even see echoes of it in modern warfare, from World War II tank ambushes to Desert Storm's feints and counterattacks. Arsuf wasn't just a medieval battle. It became a blueprint for defeating a larger, faster, more mobile enemy. But what happened next for Richard and Saladin wasn't the triumphant march to Jerusalem that many Crusaders expected. Even after shattering Saladin's field army, Richard refused to gamble everything on a risky siege. He understood something his men didn't want to hear. Winning one massive battle didn't magically solve the strategic realities of the Holy Land. The Crusaders were still far from home. Supplies were never guaranteed. Unity among Crusader leaders was fragile at best. and Saladin, despite his losses, still controlled most of the fortified cities inland. Jerusalem itself had no water reserves that a besieging army could rely on. Richard knew this. He'd read the land, studied the logistics, and understood that marching on Jerusalem in the heat of late summer with wounded men, dying horses, and limited water was a good way to win a dramatic defeat instead of another miracle victory. So instead of chasing glory, Richard stuck to strategy. He secured Jaffa. He rebuilt coastal fortifications. He strengthened supply lines. Every step looked boring. Every step frustrated his knights. Every step made political rivals back in Europe whisper that he was hesitating. But he wasn't hesitating, he was thinking. What terrified Saladin most after Arsuf wasn't the casualties. It was Richard's discipline. A reckless enemy is predictable. A patient enemy is dangerous. Saladin himself admitted in his chronicles that the Franks fought with discipline like no army we had ever faced. Multiple commanders wrote about the charge at Arsuf as if it were a supernatural force. One even said, "They came upon us like the day of judgment." That fear never faded. For the rest of the campaign, Saladin avoided another open field battle. He shifted to defensive warfare fortresses. Scorched earth supply, denial, anything to prevent Richard from getting another chance to unleash his knights. Even when negotiations began, the shadow of Arsuf loomed over every discussion. Saladin knew he could not defeat Richard in the open. Richard knew he could not take Jerusalem without enormous losses. Both men respected each other as few enemies in history ever have. In the end, the war didn't end with a dramatic siege or another legendary charge. It ended with diplomacy, a truce allowing Christian pilgrims access to Jerusalem, while the city remained under Muslim control. To some back in Europe, it looked like failure. But in reality, it was the most stable outcome the region had seen in decades. And the deciding factor behind that truce wasn't diplomacy. It was Arsuf. That 17-minute thunderbolt reshaped both sides' expectations. It convinced Saladin that Richard's army couldn't be wiped out in open battle. It convinced Richard that Jerusalem couldn't be safely held, even if captured. And it convinced both that compromise was better than another bloodbath neither side could afford. But the legacy of Arsuf didn't end even there. Military theorists for centuries afterwards studied the battle to understand why Richard's outnumbered force succeeded so overwhelmingly. The answer wasn't luck, it wasn't divine intervention, it wasn't superior weapons, it was discipline applied with almost superhuman restraint. Think about what those 7 days meant. Hundreds died before the first charge ever happened. Men marched under brutal heat, wearing armor that felt like ovens. Arrows fell hour after hour. War drums shook their nerves. They watched friends die without being able to fight back. And through all of it, they held formation. They didn't run, they didn't break ranks, they didn't charge, they waited. That is the part of Arsuf most people forget. The battle wasn't won in 17 minutes. It was won in the 7 days before those 17 minutes. The kill ratio 10-1 sounds impossible until you understand what patience did to the psychological balance. When the nightly charge finally came, it wasn't just a military maneuver, it was a dam bursting. It was vengeance, discipline, and relief exploding all at once. Saladin's veterans didn't just face a cavalry attack, they faced 7 days of pent-up fury released in a single wave. That kind of emotional shock breaks even elite soldiers. After the Crusaders returned to camp, they weren't celebrating. Chroniclers wrote that many knights simply collapsed where they stood. Some cried from exhaustion, some prayed, some stared blankly at the ground, replaying the horror and adrenaline in their minds. But as the sun set on September 7, 1191, one thing was clear: the myth of Saladin's unstoppable army had died, and a new legend, that of Richard the Lionheart's impossible victory, was born. Arsuf stands today as one of the clearest examples in history that wars aren't always won by the biggest armies or the fastest ones. Sometimes they're won by the army that can suffer the longest without breaking. Sometimes the deadliest weapon isn't steel, it's discipline. Richard didn't just defeat Saladin's troops. He defeated Saladin's strategy. He proved that a perfectly timed counterattack could rewrite the rules of the battlefield. And in that moment, under a blazing Levantine sun, with dust rising and war drums fading, an exhausted, battered army reminded the world that even when the odds look impossible, the right leader, the right discipline, and the right moment can unleash a power greater than numbers. That is the real story of Arsuf. Not just 17 minutes of fury, but 7 days of endurance that changed the course of the Crusades forever.